Welcome to the first conference of the current EPIC programme. So this programme started in April 2022, and we're very lucky and very proud to have been funded for a long time now by Scottish Government. So we've been funded by Scottish Government in this current model of EPIC since 2011, and slightly different format before that since 2006. So we're really very grateful for this long-term support that Scottish Government think that we're useful and are willing to put up with us for a few more years. So let me briefly introduce the new programme. EPIC is made up of this current EPIC programme is made up of the same 6 institutions who've been involved now for a number of years. So that's Morden, SIUC, the James Hutton Institute, BIOS, University of Glasgow and University of Edinburgh, both the Rosalind Institute and the Global Academy of Agriculture and Food Systems. And our remit in EPIC in this programme is to deliver timely and accurate research-based evidence and advice on the prevention and control of animal disease outbreaks to Scottish Government, and including expert advice in the event of outbreaks of animal disease or zoonoses, but also to stimulate innovative thinking in support of animal health policy development and delivery, and to do that through high-quality interdisciplinary research and policy-relevant outputs. So not too much to do then. We have a full programme of proposed work in EPIC, but we are also flexible with that so that we can respond to requests from Scottish Government to particular pieces of work. Our work in this EPIC is structured into 6 challenges. Between them, broadly, they cover work on early detection of disease, surveillance, preparedness and outbreak response, and on drivers of disease risk. Each of those challenges is led by experienced researchers from EPIC, but each also has 1 or 2 what we've called future lead roles. So this is a role really designed to help support researchers into leadership positions, both in terms of sort of supporting career development, but also thinking about succession. So later this afternoon, the future leads for each of the challenges will be presenting in a bit more detail the structure of the challenges, the work that's made up in each challenge, and the highlights of the work that's been done so far in this EPIC. So I'm not going to go into too much detail now about what we've been doing, because that will be covered in more detail later, but I would like to just highlight some of the things that EPIC's focused on in the last 18 months. Inevitably, a lot of our work has been focused on highly pathogenic AI. We've had a number of different pieces of work really sort of helping to support the Scottish Government, both in terms of the cases in domestic poultry and in wild birds. So when the impacts of avian influenza started to become clear, EPIC joined Nature Scott's task force on avian influenza in wild birds. And we were asked by Scottish Government to put together a risk assessment looking at the issues around collection of carcasses in wild bird mortality cases. So this work, which was led by Katie Adam, but with inputs from many others, so particularly from Sibylla Moore and Lucy Gilbert, that's informed the plans that have now been put in place in Scotland for managing wild bird mortalities, but also in England and Wales as well. Other pieces of work that we've done on avian influenza include economic analyses of impacts of housing orders on free-range poultry producers. That's work that's been led by Andrew Barnes and Nick Sparks. Phylogenetic analyses of virus spread, work led by Sam Lysett, and work looking at the attitudes of backyard producers of poultry to outbreaks and biosecurity, which has been really important in informing communications to smallholders. That was work led by Carol Kyle. We've also done quite a bit of other risk assessment work, both in terms of writing risk assessments, but also reviewing risk assessments through the 5 Nations Risk Assessment Group. And I think that response to avian influenza really highlights the breadth of expertise across EPIC. We've really had to draw on expertise from all the partners in terms of that response. Another really nice example of collaborative work across EPIC is the work on sheep scab and biosecurity that's been taking place on Lewis and Harris. This will be covered in more detail tomorrow. It will be covered in one of the parallel sessions tomorrow, so do go to that if you want to hear more about it. But broadly speaking, this work has been focusing on improving sheep scab control, but also looking more generally at the issues of biosecurity in crofting communities, and particularly in the face of changing crofting dynamics and demographics. So this was work, again, it's a collaboration across EPIC. It involves people from Morden, from James Hutton, from SIUC and from the University of Glasgow. So pulling in expertise on social science and behaviour from Claire Hardy and Carol Kyle, on sheep movements from Sue Tung and Julie Sterling, and then particularly on the sheep scab diagnostics and on the control of sheep scab, led by Stu Burgess and others at Morden. And this work also builds on work that's funded through Scottish Government Strategic Research Programme. So in between working on avian influenza, we have continued to work on other notifiable diseases. So looking, for example, at scenarios of different standstill regulations and how that impacts on the spread of foot and mouth disease. This is work led by Sibylla Moore. And the impacts of that work are currently being taken forward through the Scottish Markets Working Group. And we've also done quite a bit looking at modelling African swine fever, both looking in domestic pigs and in wild boar. That's work done by Gianluigi Rossi, Teresita Suarez and Stephen Casherell. EPIC work continues to support the eradication campaign for BVD. So the sampling of the sequencing of samples at Morden has continued, with now a huge number of sequence samples, over 5,500 in the database, which is helping to support the final stages of that campaign. And with support from EPIC, SIUC has been establishing the Veterinary Surveillance Intelligence Unit, particularly focused this year on bringing together relevant data sets for animal health surveillance. That's led by John Berezeski. As well as these specific outputs, we've also spent quite a bit of time recently thinking about how we operate in EPIC. So not just what outputs we produce, but how do we go about doing that? And we really wanted to make sure that we weren't perpetuating ways of working which I think unfortunately are not uncommon in academia, that mean that some people, maybe for reasons of perhaps seniority or gender or other aspects, end up being disadvantaged or less supported. So we've been really consciously thinking how we do things, thinking about things like meeting culture, how we allocate roles or opportunities, and trying to come up together with ways of working to make things fairer. And this is obviously important in itself, but it also means that our output's better if everyone's able to contribute more effectively. So in terms of personnel with a new programme, we've obviously also had some changes in personnel. There's a few new faces around. Please do talk to people that you don't know and meet some of the new people in EPIC. In particular, there's a couple of people I'd like to mention who have left EPIC recently. So firstly, Amy Jennings, who has been part of EPIC for many years, in a really important role at the policy liaison end of things, but also involved in a huge number of other things and leading other pieces of work. Thankfully, Amy hasn't gone very far. She's gone to APHA, so we still get to work with Amy there. And Nick Sparks has recently stepped down. We've worked with Nick for many years on EPIC. We've really relied on his enormous expertise about the poultry industry and also just his kindness and his wisdom as a collaborator. So we'll really miss Nick as well. I'd also like to offer up some congratulations. So I'd like to congratulate Ian McKendrick. I think Ian's just run away. Who was recently awarded a visiting chair at University of Glasgow. And to Lisa, who has recently become the head of the vet school at University of Edinburgh. And also to Katie Adam, who was recently promoted at University of Edinburgh and now is taking on one of the challenge lead roles in EPIC. Would you just join me in thanking Amy and Nick and congratulating Ian and Lisa and Katie? I also wanted to mention Irene Pennycook. Irene passed away recently. She'd worked at the Scottish Government for many years. She was enormously kind to Lisa and I when we first started working at Stockton House. We didn't really know what was going on or what to do, and she completely looked after us. And her kindness, but also her quite wicked sense of humour, definitely lightened our days at Stockton. I know she's much missed. So over the last 10 years that I've been part of EPIC, I think we've learned quite a lot about how to work in this kind of science policy niche. We've been working with a lot of our colleagues at Scottish Government for a long time, certainly Nia, Sheila, Alistair, many more for over 10 years now. And I think these relationships are really important. We put a lot of work into kind of thinking about our policy interface, the role of knowledge brokers, and Lisa will cover more of that later. But I think the fact that we have worked together successfully for such a long time and that we have trusted but also very important relationships with the policy teams is really what shows that this works. So I guess you might say, if we've been doing this for so long, how are we still working on preparedness? Are we not prepared enough yet? But this feels like quite a challenging time. The factors that drive all of the risks, the pathogens, the behaviours, the measures that we need to think about to mitigate those risks are really dynamic. We've had an unprecedented HPAI outbreak over the last couple of years with hundreds of cases in domestic poultry across the UK, causing enormous impacts. But also tens of thousands of deaths of wild birds, really concerning given a lot of the pressures that many of those species are under in other ways. It feels like we see the impacts of climate change more and more every day. It's quite hard to sort of comprehend or imagine quite what the scale or the complexity of the changes coming from that are going to be. And it feels like everywhere there's language of disagreement, of conspiracy theories, of misinformation. It can feel like quite a difficult time to be a scientist. And the disease threats change as well. So we have, for example, African swine fever sort of knocking on our door from Europe, even while we're still trying to cope with HPAI. So I think in the face of all this, it can feel like a bit of an impossible task to achieve anything really, but the complex and changing nature of these issues really highlight why there is so much to do. And I think also highlight why a One Health approach that considers how these factors are linked, considers the interdependencies between animal and human health and environment, is so important. We can't just stick animal health in a silo and deal with it there, any more than we can just use one approach or one discipline to deal with these other issues. So that's the reason the focus of our conference this year is on One Health. We really do have to think about all these complexities if we're going to have any chance of tackling animal health effectively. So what does APIC need to do looking forwards to make sure that Scottish Government has the advice and the input that it needs to protect animal health in the face of all these substantial challenges? At the last conference, Dominic Mellor, who was the previous director, talked about the challenges of maintaining our policy interface, about data, about technical expertise, knowledge broker roles, about industry interfaces, and about how to remain agile. And I could easily talk about any of those things again. They're all hugely important. They're all very much things that EPIC puts time into and will need to continue to put time into. I mean, just as an example, data access and data management in particular requires an awful lot of time and effort, and it doesn't get any easier. And just want to acknowledge all of the work that the data team and the data governance committee have been putting into managing the data side of things. But I wanted to pick out a couple of other issues looking forwards. I think thinking about the wider threats and the challenges of the sort that I was talking about before, they're an important part of EPIC and inherent to much of EPIC's work to think about how we can consider animal health in those contexts looking forwards. But we do have to make sure that we're thinking widely enough. I'd like to give an example for some previous EPIC work. Some of you might remember that in 2016 we held some workshops to look at the future of animal health surveillance in Scotland. Some of you were involved in those. And we used an approach called scenario planning, which looks forward to create plausible scenarios that might exist in 2030, was the date that we used in that case. And one of the scenarios that we created in that workshop was at the time viewed as being really the least desirable of the scenarios that we'd created. And although scenario planning doesn't particularly look at kind of the likelihood of different scenarios, it collectively was felt that it was unlikely that we were going to reach that particular scenario. 7 years on, we've already gone past the point of many of the aspects in that scenario. And I think at the time we found it hard to imagine that we could get so far down that route. I think it's human nature to find it difficult to imagine how much things might change over time. So I think there is a danger that if we don't think widely enough, even though we can see how much the world is changing around us, then we're not going to be coming up with strategies, with approaches that are actually going to address all those issues. So we need to be bold and we need to be open in our thinking to make sure that we are thinking about the right things to address them. Secondly, I think in EPIC we have to be careful not to be complacent. I think that particularly following COVID, there's been quite a lot of reports of sort of highlighting how important long-term trusted relationships are in kind of between policymakers and research, and how it's only in that situation that you're going to get really meaningful evidence for policy. And I think EPIC we know this approach works. We've been doing it for a long time and we do that well. And we should celebrate that. But we do still need to be looking forwards and innovating and evolving if we want to make sure that we can continue to be a really good model for getting scientific research into evidence-based policy in the face of the sort of the changing issues and the challenges around us. And following on from that, I think my third point and the last kind of main thing that I wanted to cover is to highlight that when we set up this EPIC program this time, we did so using a challenge-based approach. So we developed problem trees for each of the challenges so that we could think about what the core issues were for each of those challenges, what impacts they have, what are the causes relating to that. The reason for doing that in particular was to try to avoid having solutions in need of a problem, but rather to be really strategic about actually what was needed to address the problems, what disciplines we needed to bring together, what sort of science we actually needed to do. And there's some really great examples of collaborations across the disciplines in EPIC, which I've mentioned some of already. But doing research which is really interdisciplinary is challenging. It requires time and effort and patience and engagement. And I think this is quite a good point, 18 months in, to reflect on this challenge-led approach. I think if we can really make the most of this approach, it helps us to be reflective and proactive about the work that we're doing, and to make sure that the work that we're doing is the right work to have impact, particularly in a changing world. So to finish up, it's really lovely to be here in person and to see everybody today in person. It still feels like a bit of a novelty seeing everybody. I missed the last conference because unfortunately I was taking part in industrial action at the time. We've got quite a diverse audience here, so there's obviously lots of researchers from EPIC and from elsewhere, but also lots of people from policy, from Scottish Government, from DEFRA, from APHA, from the livestock industry and more. I think this conference is really important for EPIC. It's really nice to have an opportunity to showcase our work, but it's also really important for us to get feedback from you. So please, whatever your role, please be willing to comment, to give feedback, to ask questions, to stimulate discussion, to help us think about priorities going forwards. We'd really welcome your input. I think you're our friends, but we'd like you to also be our critical friends, and help us just to continue to do interesting work.